Made it hard to say anything mean about him now. Thank you, Andy. And I want to thank you all for being here and thank whoever's responsible for inviting me to speak on the lectures. Kind of. Because I think it's a little mean to ask a former graduate who's obviously so young to come and tell you about the correct view of preachers. To a group of people who taught me how to be a preacher, and to many others in this auditorium right now who have been preaching, well, longer than I've been alive, quite literally. But with the help of the scripture found in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 15, maybe we can still together find out some information to help us all understand the glorious profession of preaching and better of what we should be as preachers and how they should be viewed by those who are not preachers. You know, really, there may be no more confusing position in the world than the position of being a preacher. The denominational world has really confused it over the years. Of course, developing what is known as the pastoral system and a total misunderstanding of the scriptural labels of a preacher versus an elder versus the other words used for elder in the scriptures. Of course, even in more recent time, that system has developed into different types of pastors, having a youth pastor, an administrative pastor, a counseling pastor, so on and so forth, to where you even wonder if that pastoral system has any preachers in it anymore, and, well, maybe they never did. Unfortunately, in an effort to keep up with the Joneses, some churches are doing the same thing. Some schools are doing the same thing, where we are emphasizing working on these other specialty items, but not really teaching men to preach anymore. And it's a shame, because we need good men who will be preachers. In 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 1 through 15, Paul is addressing the church in Corinth about what the preacher is, what he should be, and how he should work throughout his day. We read starting in verse 1, "And I, brethren, could not speak to you as spiritual people, but as to carnal, as to babes in Christ. I fed you with milk and not with solid food, for until now you were not able to receive it. And even now you are still not able, for you are still carnal. For where there are envy, strife, and divisions among you, are you not carnal, and behaving like mere men? For when one says, I am of Paul, and another, I am of Apollos, are you not carnal?" Paul first just sets out the problem. They were being too fleshly. He was criticizing the church and saying, you're being too much like the world. You're being like flesh and not like what you should be spiritually. In fact, he uses an image we see other places in the New Testament, particularly in Hebrews 5, verses 11 and 12, of this image of them being babies, them still being children spiritually, so that he has to focus on a lesson they should already understand instead of teaching them greater things. It's a reminder to all of us that we should constantly be striving to grow spiritually. It's a reminder to all of us that we should be pushing our boundaries so that we are not babies anymore, but that we are spiritually growing, becoming, well, the natural progression of adolescents spiritually and eventually adults spiritually, because that's how it should be. And after all, we should be craving the meat of the word and not just the baby food. Oh, we've all seen it, those of us who have children. I can say that now. Those of us who have children have seen when they are about ready to make that jump from that wonderful goop known as baby food, that I was always surprised at how tasteless that stuff was. Yes, I tried it a few times, usually, peeling it off somewhere on my body. And it just has no flavor. You think, oh, it can't be that bad. It is. And we see in little children's faces that as they are stuck eating the goop, we bring out, at the restaurant, our good food that's solid and has flavor, has seasoning on it, tastes like something, and they eye it. They can't take their eyes off of it. I want some of that. That's how we should be spiritually. We should want some of that. We should want the adult food. We should desire it, and we try to reach for it. And what Paul here is saying to the Corinthians is, look, you're still on baby food when you should be desiring the real stuff, the good stuff. And he doesn't leave them guessing why. He doesn't leave them going, okay, we have a problem, Paul, we understand. Now we need a solution. They're going to get the solution. He goes on to tell them there in verse 3 that you're still carnal, you're like flesh, because of envy, strife, and divisions. And really what this boils down to is they were full of jealousy, and they were infighting, and they were challenging each other, and they were divided. We learned yesterday morning that the Corinth church, among many problems it had, was this idea of division and being divided according to men, according to, I was baptized by Paul, I was baptized by Apollos, I was baptized by Cephas, and based on those facts, they were saying, we're greater because so-and-so baptized us. That wasn't how it was to be. There was to be no divisions. And let's say there was a group of Paulites at the Corinthian church. Let's just pretend that Paul was literally labeling a group that was devoted to him. Paul's condemning them right beside all the other groups. Paul here is showing he had no desire. He had no thought of leading the party, of leading the church in such a way that would be divisive. And really what it comes down to is if we are to be the church that we are to be, we cannot be devoted to men because they're mere men. We must be devoted to God. Paul's writing this letter to the Corinthian church. And one thing he makes plain throughout this letter is that the Corinthian church, there was a reason for their problems. One of those reasons was their past life. And I think we need to remember that Paul lists the sinful behavior of the people in Corinth and then says, and some were some of you. You were just like that. Sin has an effect on us. Let us not be so arrogant that we don't think it does. And it may have even been that in the Corinthian world, in that area, that there were temples of various pagan deities competing for attention, competing for adherents to come in and worship, and that there might have been rival teachers that had risen up to certain amounts of power in that city, and they might have been dividing among themselves the people, trying to gain more power and position. And this is what the Corinthians were converted out of. And that's the key. They were converted out of it. Because Paul goes on to say in chapter 6, but you were washed. So yes, that old sinful behavior has an effect on them, but they need to get rid of it because they were washed. And they need to fight that sinful behavior, just as we all need to fight our own sinful behavior, our old sinful habits that can still come and haunt us. And so laying out the problem of being divided among men in the church, of being more devoted to men than to God in the church, Paul lays out this problem and then says, here's the solution. Here's how you should view the preacher. He starts in verse 5. Who then is Paul and who is Apollos, but ministers, through whom you believe as the Lord gave to each one? I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. I am thankful for this topic that has been assigned for me because I can't tell you in how many sermons I've quoted verse 6 without looking into the context. Maybe we've all done that with certain favorite passages. The context of verse 6 is so rich, though, it just makes that verse pop all the more if we understand why Paul is saying it. And so we go back to verse 5 where Paul just simply says, who is Paul and who is Apollos? But ministers. Now even we have become to use the term minister as a term of position. It is not. And we should not use it as such. Out in the world, they can't understand when I just say, I'm just a preacher. Is just a preacher a title now? They can't understand it, but I'm just trying to get across to the world to understand that I'm just a man that has a profession, a great one, with great responsibility, but I'm still just a man. The problem is that we sometimes have to convince the church of that too, because they don't understand it either. When Paul uses this term that they are just ministers, that comes from the word diakonos, which is the word for servant. In fact, throughout the Bible, the word is translated servant 7 times, minister 23 times, and even deacon 3 times. And these words are used as synonyms to say you're just a servant. And I know that may even sound trivial. It sounds trivial coming out of my mouth to say the preacher's just a servant, but that's exactly what Paul is saying, because we understand that servants are people who serve. They're people of lower position. They have to lower themselves for some reason or another because they are just servants. They are not leaders of a party. In fact, when a servant tries to become a leader of a party, well, the ruling class finds it rather revolting. They don't like it. In fact, in the Roman Empire, when a group of slaves would rise up a leader and would try to fight against the crowd, what do the Romans do? They squashed it. Tragically, hatefully, they squashed it. Now, we're not here to talk about the morals of slave revolts, but we're here to understand that when Paul uses this term that preachers are to be servants, that these men who are spreading the gospel throughout the world are to be servants, he is lowering them and saying, you are to take a lower position, not a higher one, because of the profession you've chosen. You're a servant. And if Paul, who was said to have turned the whole world upside down in Acts 17:6, says that he is just a servant, who are we today as preachers to say we're anything more? We can't. When we look at the body of work that Paul has, we can't compare. And we must humble ourselves. Now, Paul goes on to point that they are servants with the same goal. They are servants with the same goal of doing the work of God, of spreading the gospel, and so they aren't leading different parties. He's saying you can't be Apollosites, and you can't be Paulites, and you can't be Cephalsites, because Paul, Cephas, and Apollos aren't rival leaders. We all have the same goal. The goal is spreading the gospel. Oh, sure, they may be different parts of the body like we talked about yesterday, and they may be doing it in different ways, different styles to different people in different fields, but that's exactly what we need. We need preachers who are united in the cause of spreading the gospel to different fields in different ways. There may be somebody you can talk to that I can't, that won't listen to me. I don't know why. Okay, maybe I do. The whole point being is we need all of us united spreading the gospel, not fighting each other, not leading our own parties. And that's exactly what Paul is laying out here, is we have the same goal, because he says, as servants, verse 6, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And here Paul is going to go into his second illustration of what a preacher is to be, starting first with that idea of being a servant, and secondly, being a farmer. And he says, as a preacher who's a farmer, I planted, Apollos came behind me, he watered, but in the end, it's God who gives the increase. In our congregation up in Hermitage, we got a family of farmers. And every time I've said this, they haven't said I was wrong, so I'm going to go with it. Oh, they plant, they cultivate, they take care of the ground. They are meticulously hard workers to make sure everything happens, to give the seeds they put in the ground the best chance to grow. But in the end, they know it's up to God. They can't make it grow. They can only do the work to make it potentially grow. And that's what the preacher does. He does the work to make the potential growth happen, and God will give the increase. It's God's place to do so. It's God's place to cause the growth to happen. We may never even see the growth. We may plant the seed and move on, and the growth may come later. Sometimes we may hear about it. Sometimes we may never hear about it until the final day. Maybe not even then. Because all we're supposed to do is cultivate and let God do the growth, just like a farmer does. Paul extends this illustration into verse 7 where we read, "So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one will receive his own reward according to his own labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, you are God's building." So he goes on with this illustration of farming and the preacher being the farmer, the one cultivating the crop. And in verse 7, he actually lowers the preacher to the lowest thing he might have ever been called in history. And I've heard preachers called a lot of low things. But Paul says in his own words, preachers are nothing. To be honest, when I reread this, I'm, Paul, what are you saying? How could you say this about us? What we're doing, what we've given up, what we've sacrificed, how can you just say we're nothing? But there's a reason he says we're nothing. Preachers are nothing because God is everything. We're just humble servants. God is everything. We're just the farmer. God is everything. We might be a builder, as we'll get to momentarily, but God is everything. And so in the end, we're nothing. In fact, if God wants it done, we might have privilege to be part of it, but it will get done with or without us. And so we must take the opportunity to cultivate when we have it presented to us. And again, after saying that the preachers are nothing, he says because God gives the increase. God gives the reward. It's God who we have to rely on. It's God who we have to connect to. After all, it's God who gave us Christ, who is the mediator between man and God. 1 Timothy 2:5. It's God who is continually cleansing us from all our sins. He is the one that has extended grace to us. He's the only reason we can be a preacher. He's the only reason we can be a Christian. He's the only reason we can be anything we are. The past 2 Sundays I preached one lesson. Don't worry, I have a time limit here. About without Christ. Because without Christ, we find out in Colossians, there's not even creation. We don't even exist. We can't even be here without Christ physically. And we definitely can't be here without Christ spiritually. Because it's the gifts of God through His Son, Jesus Christ, that gives us everything. And that's why Paul can boldly say, we're nothing. Because it's only by the grace of God that we can do what we're doing. And so Paul is continually talking about the divisive attitude and trying to get them to overcome it and trying to get them to move beyond being devoted to these individual teachers. When he moves on and says in verse 8, "Now he who plants and he who waters are one, and each one will receive his own reward according to his labor." Now, the examples Paul uses of people who the Corinthians may or may not have been dividing over, we know Paul, Apollos, Cephas, the specific ones he mentioned, they were not trying to lead individual parties. But maybe Paul was using these men who would have been considered great among the first century church and still considered pretty great today. Maybe he was just using them as examples for localized teachers in the Corinthian church who were trying to divide. We don't know. We just don't know. And maybe in some little way, this is Paul's ironic twist to this whole situation by saying, look, those who you consider great teachers in the church aren't trying to divide it up. Why are the lesser teachers trying to divide it up? You have no place. But whichever it may be, it just really comes down to the point in verse 8 that we're one. We're working for the same cause. We're not competing, we're not fighting, we're not sheep stealing, we're not trying to create those environments. We are to be one, united as one, working for the cause of God. In fact, when people view Christians, deacons, elders, preachers, the wonderful sisters of the church, when people view us, they should see God. Maybe it's even happened to you. You meet somebody in your community and you want to invite them to come and visit the worship service at your local congregation. And the response is, oh, I don't go there. They're always fighting amongst each other. I've heard it. I bet you have too. Brethren, it ought not be. That should not be the case. We are to be united for the same cause, not infighting, not being divisive, not being what Paul's describing in Corinth. We should be united, and we should be united in God. In fact, that's the only way we can be united. We can pay lip service to other types of unity that the world's created that is not true unity. There again, see the lectures from yesterday. But if we are truly to be united, we can only be united in God. Period. Just like the farmer only has success if God gives it, the church, the ministers of the church can only have success if God gives it. And so Paul says in verse 9 that we are God's fellow workers. Just think about that for a moment. God's fellow workers. We're working for the same mission that God is working for because God gave the mission. And God is not a God that won't get his hands dirty. In fact, he got them dirtier than any of our other hands when he did send his son, and his son was crucified on the cross. And so we're God's fellow workers for the cause that he died for. And it goes on to say, you are God's field, and quickly turns, you are God's building. You know, this is one of the things that makes me more nervous preaching in general, and especially in this room today, than anything I can think of, is we're taking Paul's wonderfully, almost poetic writings, inspired by the Holy Spirit, and dissecting them and adding my own commentary to it. Because I can't turn a point like Paul does, where Paul just goes, see, we're God's fellow workers. You're God's field. You're God's building. It's beautiful imagery he's using here. And to me, I find a lot of poeticness in it, that he's emphasizing you're the success that God wants to see. You're the success. You're the growth. You're the increase that God is giving us. In fact, you're God's building. It's been emphasized throughout the years that this building we're in is not the church. The church is the people that makes it up. In the New Testament, several times this image of building is used as a reference to the church, not referring to an actual physical building, but 26 times referring to the people becoming the building. The building here is a synonymous, the idea of building, the idea of being a builder is synonymous with the idea of edifying the church. In fact, the term edifying is a building term, talking about the archways used to make sure a building stands. And so when we're talking about the church being the building, we're talking about the church being built up, being encouraged, being sent out to do what it's meant to do in a positive way. Paul here is not only turning the imagery in such a beautiful way, he's turning the idea from being the negative, I'm getting on to you, you're doing something wrong, you need to fix it, to the positive, and here's how to do it. You know, it's a reminder again to us that we can't just point out the problems and expect people to go fix them on their own. We got to give solutions. And the best solution we can give to the world is that Christ died for them. Oh, there's other problems we may talk about. We may encourage people to work on building stronger families. We should. We may encourage people to be a better person at the workplace, to be a better person in the neighborhood, at home. We can encourage people to go out and teach and teach them how to teach, as Paul told Timothy to do. We can do all these things, and we should do all these things, but in the end, the best solution we can give people to build them up, to fix all their problems, is the solution of Christ. That's what they need. When they get Christ in the right place, everything else will fall in line. We read in verse 10, according to the grace of God which was given to me as a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation, and another builds on it, but let each one take heed how he builds on it. For no other foundation can one lay than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each one's work will become clear. For the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. If anyone's work which he has built on it endures, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss. But he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. And so in going back to verse 10, we see that Paul is just saying, the preacher's a builder. And Paul's saying, by the grace of God, he was allowed to be a builder in Corinth. And he laid the foundation. And this was so key to this entire discussion. What's the foundation he laid? Verse 11. He laid the foundation of Paul. No. He laid the foundation of a denomination. No. He laid the foundation of division. No. He laid the foundation of Jesus Christ. Because that's the only foundation the church can be built on. In fact, Jesus himself said that he came to build his church in Matthew 16, and that he was building it on the foundation of the fact that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's what Peter confessed. And that's what Jesus built the church on, was the fact of who he is. And then we also see that Christ calls himself the chief cornerstone. Now he refers to the prophecy saying, I was the chief cornerstone laid aside, but that didn't mean I wasn't worthwhile. That didn't mean I really wasn't the cornerstone they should be building on. Well, maybe to be a little vulgar, they were just too stupid to know better. They didn't realize I was the foundation they needed to build on. And so, Paul here says, when I came to you, I laid the foundation of Jesus Christ for the building. Now, I also know a few construction workers, and they've never contradicted me when I said this, so I'm going to go with it. Foundations are important. There you go. Fact for the day. But I know just throughout the little time I've been here on this world, I've seen several buildings have to be condemned, have to be torn down because their foundation was laid poorly. And was even cracking in some cases. And we see buildings that their foundations were not laid. I was just on the West Coast, and they have something out there called an earthquake. And I went up in the West Coast, I went up on the Space Needle in Seattle to the very top of it. And as I was reading, and I never told my wife this, as I was reading about the Space Needle, it said, it has survived 3 earthquakes. I'm looking at that thing thinking, well, guess it survived 3, it could have survived 4. Why could that odd structure that really looks like it could fall over at any minute in a good gust of wind. Why does it withstand that? Well, because they built a good foundation for it. All the buildings out there, they laid special foundations to make sure they would stand if the earth starts shaking. I'm not saying they always succeeded. We know they haven't, but they've tried, and good for them and good for the Space Needle, because I made it back down. The whole point being is that Paul here is saying, I laid the best foundation for you, and a foundation that won't crack, a foundation that can't go away. It is the chief cornerstone. It's the best foundation. It's the foundation of Jesus Christ. And that's what I came to tell you. That's what I came to give you. Not Paul, not Apollos, not some other teacher. I came to give you Jesus Christ. And that is what preachers are to do. And that is what Christians are to do in the world. It's not just preachers, it's all of us. We are to give the world Jesus Christ by shining our lights in whatever ways we can, so that others can build themselves on that great foundation. And then Paul goes on in verse 12 to say, now if anyone builds on this foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, it's always interesting on certain sections of scriptures to see how much is written about them by the commentators. And this is one of those scriptures that there's been much written about, trying to get explanations for each one of these materials being built. And honestly, maybe I'm just simple, but I find the simple explanations the better ones. And the simple explanation that I found was that you got here 3 materials that are really good, really worth something, and 3 materials that, well, really aren't, especially when you go on and read verses 13 through 15. But the key is that we are to be building, and we are to try to build with the best materials that will last, like gold, silver, and precious stones, and not just material that will be, well, as the illustration goes, burned up, like wood, hay, and straw. I mean, we tell our kids about the big bad wolf. What does that teach us? There's just some things that aren't good to build with. And don't fight a hungry wolf. You know, it's just really interesting that he uses these materials, but let's not overcomplicate something that can be simple. And the simple lesson is we are to build, and we're to try to use good material. Why, Paul? Verse 13. Each one's work will become clear. For the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. See, there's going to come a time that all the building we've done is going to be tested. Now, there again, this is another place where commentators just write and write and write. Because what is the test? When is the test going to come? And there's the big debate that the commentaries I looked at were divided over whether it was talking about the final day of judgment or a day of persecution that was closer to the Corinthian time. And to be honest, I don't know which one it was. Aren't you glad you came this morning? But what I do know is the Corinthians knew which one it was, and that they were being encouraged that there was a time of testing coming. Whether it's the final day or whether it was persecution coming in their time, we don't know, but we do know it was coming. And we do know still today it's coming, whether it's facing the trials of this daily life or the final day. The trial is coming, and our fortitude for serving Christ is going to be tested. Our faith and our development and our attachment to the foundation is going to be tested in our daily trials and on the final day. And so whichever one Paul is talking about, it still applies. Because the lesson is, so we better be using the best stuff. That's the lesson. Because Paul's now going from talking about the builder to the building that's being done and saying, make sure you use the best stuff. Make sure you use the stuff that is going to last, that is going to make it, that when the fire comes, it will stand. When the earthquake shakes it, you'll be able to write that it shook it 3 times and it did not fall. And scare everybody half to death going up in the elevator. Each one's work will become clear, verse 13. For the day will declare it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test each one's work of what sort it is. It will be known what material you used. In fact, there's a lesson in here for us to be reminded you can't get away with it. You can't get away with faulty wiring. You can't get away with using the wrong material. You can't get away. See, that's why I'm not an architect or an engineer. Because when I buy that little flat box that's going to become some great piece of furniture, I cut corners. Whatever I need to do to get that thing just together to go stand up there, stop agreeing with me, Katie. Whatever I do, I just want to get it done so that I can put the new stuff on it, the new books on it, the new whatever on it. I cut corners, which is why you better be glad I'm not an architect or an engineer. But what Paul here is saying is, when you're building the building of Christ, when you're building the church that Christ died for, you do not cut corners, because it will be found out. And once again, we can ask, well, why, Paul? Verse 14. If anyone's work which he has built on it endures, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned, he will suffer loss, but he himself will be saved, yet so as through fire. See, what Paul says in these verses at the end of this section is if you've used good materials, it'll be standing. If you use bad materials, it will fall. Now, I don't necessarily think this is talking about the specific builder, that the builder will be punished if someone he's converted falls away, because our salvation is based on our own, not on anybody else's. In fact, Paul laid that out earlier in this passage. But if you've ever brought somebody to Christ that's fallen away, you've had sleepless nights. You've had tear-filled nights. You've cried. You've reached out to them. You've been upset by what they've done to the point of just wanting to grab them and shake them. But sometimes they are just stubbornly still, pulling away. And that brings heartache. And I think maybe in a way that's the punishment spoken about here. That we do suffer loss when the church that we are building that's based on the foundation of Christ suffers loss. Because we should. Yet when we have success, when we see that person that we've had a hand in teaching and God's given the increase and seeing the gospel grow in him, isn't it grand? Isn't it just so encouraging when you see someone who you've encouraged living a great Christian life on whatever level it may be? There's maybe nothing more that swells us with, well, I'll just say it even though we don't like the word, pride. When we see someone that we had a hand in, that we had the grace of God to be involved in farming, cultivating, involved in building, involved in serving them. When they succeed, we rejoice. And so Paul here really gives us a view of the church that is grand, as it should be, not divisive on these parties, but just totally connected to God and the foundation of Christ over all other things. In fact, there's nothing else we can build on. And if we build on that, if we farm the gospel, if we lower ourselves and humbly serve God and others, God will give us the increase. Thank you.